Our next topic is about endemic biodiversity, how to protect endemic biodiversity in the light of urbanization in such biodiverse areas. So recently, Colombia approved the study and construction of a port in the Tribuga Gulf, which is in the Choco region of Colombia. This area has a lot of biodiversity, it's a lot of endemic biodiversity, and provides a lot of ecosystem services, tourism, etc. Such projects are becoming very widespread all across emerging markets. How do you think emerging markets governments and the businesses in these emerging markets should balance such economic development projects with environmental considerations?
So, in general, sustainability is about balancing the social, the environmental, and the economic. And I think one of the concerns that one always has to have is to what extent are one of the three, or one or more of the three being sacrificed for another, right? So I don't know enough about the Colombia example to know. I would want to know what areas were scoped as potentially beneficial for the port in terms of where it could go in technically, did it have the deep water, all of these issues. Or are we talking about, somebody had land and just wants to, look, there's nothing there, it's just a bunch of animals, flora and fauna, it doesn't matter. That's really short-sighted. To simply say there's nothing there, there's no value there, not just diminishes the intrinsic value of flora and fauna that might be in an area, but as you're saying, I don't know enough about what the local community is. I don't know enough about, to what extent is Colombia as a country actually knowledgeable about what the biodiversity is in the region and the value that has long-term for things like pharmaceuticals, agriculture, and other ecotourism, all of these other uses. Those tend to sort of get thrown to the side because people simply look at, all right, we're going to put a port here and we'll do an economic cost benefit. And then what goes into the benefit side can often be overemphasized compared to what goes into the cost side. And that's just very poor planning and poor decision making from my standpoint. It's bad business. Yes, somebody will, a port can be built. Likelihood is somebody or a few entities will get particularly wealthy off of that. But did that port have to go in that place? Now, if all of that information has been collected and analyzed, and that is the best place for a port, then I understand for development, some places are going to become spoiled. We understand that. But there's no reason not to be smart about it anymore. I mean, there's no reason not to be smart about it in a developing country, and there's no reason not to be smart about it in an emerging economy. The idea of we're an emerging economy, we have much more economic pressure, all of these sort of tropes that are put out there as a reason why this should be done. And it's silly because we know, looking at the experience of developed countries, they mortgaged so much value decades and even centuries ago by poor decision making. We should be smarter now. There's no reason not to be able to have the economic development we want with the minimal impact on social and environmental assets that we have. And if you mortgage those now, you don't get them back.
Interesting. So you mentioned a very good business point here that the returns that businesses would gain by practicing such sustainable practices, returns that the country would gain by doing such extensive studies or not developing, say, a port in the most geographically ideal, geopolitically ideal place because of environmental concerns versus doing it at a less ideal place. Those returns will be lower than what is being done currently. How do you think businesses and governments to some extent should communicate the fact that the returns will be lower to their investors and the immediate policymakers?
I guess first I'd want to know what the actual calculations around determining, whether something is going to be lower or not. What's driving that? Because at the end of the day, you really, we look at it financially. People get spooked by numbers. People get spooked by financial analysis. They tend to take a complex financial analysis that's been put down in front of them as the word of God. And it's an analysis built on a bunch of assumptions. And those assumptions should be examined, questioned, discussed in collaboration. It's not just about business and government coming together. It's about civil society coming together as well, communities coming together, and looking at that in a really rigorous way. I think if a decision was made to put a port somewhere because geographically they thought this is the best place for it, well, what are we assuming about geography? Are we saying that this area of the country needs a port, so let's put it here because there's nothing there right now? Or are we saying this area needs a port, these are the criteria by which we need to look for, that we need to put a port, and it should include technical components. How deep is the water? What's the distance between the port and, say, urban areas or other modes of the supply chain? But is that the only one? And maybe all of these things were already done. There've been environmental impact assessments. All of these types of decisions have been looked at really carefully, but a lot of times those aren't. And there's other incentives that are driving people to go to a specific location. Some of those have to do with political issues, and some of those are simply out of expediency. It just seems good. There's nothing else there but woods right now. There's nothing there but mountainous terrain or wetlands. Who has value for wetlands? Looking at those geographic areas, determining they have no value, making assumptions about what the value of that space is, building that into your financial models and saying this is the best place we can be, I think it's incumbent upon everybody to truly look at what the assumptions are and see whether the lack of value in the existing use of that land is truly what people with certain self-interest have determined it is. That there should be agreement on that. That there should be a transparent discussion about that. If all those things line up, okay, I understand it. But more often than not, there are better options that can be had. People just get lazy and cut corners and don't do them.
That's a very strong argument, and I think Jorge also had some views
I
around the
have
same.
a very similar opinion to Professor Milstein. Actually, I think the Colombian government should determine the social and environmental costs and damage that this port can make to the environment. And they should also estimate the benefits of this project to the community and ask themselves if this is going to increase the economic and social wealth of the community. But personally, I don't support the construction of this port. I have three reasons. The first one is, right now in Colombia, we have the Buenaventura port that is located in the Pacific region. And this port is not used at its full capacity. So we should look for new strategies to use the full potential of this port before we construct a new one in the Pacific coast. The second argument that I have is that the Chocó region has not the infrastructure to transport the cargo that would come in and out of the country through this port. So we will have to build highways in the middle of the Pacific jungle. So we will be affecting another ecosystem of the region. And the third one is that I don't think that we should compromise the endemic biodiversity that we have for this type of projects. Instead, we should use ecotourism and the ecosystem services, and this will benefit the communities and may increase their economic activity without compromising the environment of the area.
And if you go back to the first question we had and the discussion we were having about government setting a vision and then setting a policy. So if you're going to say, I think too often in the planning process, we say we're going to put a port here because this is going to generate a certain kind of value. And then, an alternative opinion like your own will come in and say, I think there's better value and better use of it. And then, but that value kind of stands up against no policy going forward, right? And what the government and others ought to really be doing is saying, okay, scenario A is we put this port in here and it generates certain economic advantages, but also has ecological and social costs. Let's factor those in transparently. But then let's say if we're going to use this in a different way, and the government not just decided not to put a port there, but decided to put policies and programs in place that would encourage the development of ecotourism, the cataloging and usage of flora and fauna for pharmaceutical or manufacturing other uses, and actually built that out. Didn't just take it as business as usual, but said, we have two choices as government. We could encourage the use of this space as a port, or we could encourage the use of this place for multi-uses that have both industrial, could have potential industrial and commercial uses as well as things like ecotourism and green space and even carbon sequestration. I mean,
Correct.
build the model of those two scenarios, then compare them.
Build out different scenarios. Look at the opportunity cost of your business decision. And when we say opportunity cost, this opportunity cost should include the long-term environmental costs as well. And ecotourism can be an amazing alternative, especially in such biodiverse spots. So.
And don't assume in the one thing with the opportunity cost we have to be careful with economics is let's not assume that the past defines the present, defines the future. That the future is on a trend line, right? And that things are going to change the same, they're going to be the same in 5 to 10 years or 15 to 20 years as they are today. Because the one thing we know is they will not be. And if we're going to start doing comparisons of the present and the future, we have to start to take account what the real future looks like based on what we know from science, from economics, from everything else. Put that into the model. Because it doesn't look like, it's not how things look today. Things change radically when you go forward.
And actually, when you say assess the cost, one of the issues is who is going to assess the cost. If it's only the company, of course, the company will have a certain way of operating. Absolutely. And all the external costs, they won't feature in. So that's why there the government has a role to play, so that the cost for the community, for the population, the medium or long-term cost needs to be part of the calculation of a firm. And that's basically perhaps where the difficulty is. Because from a company point of view, the calculation can make absolute economic sense now, because these external costs are not necessarily, and they are usually not taken into account. So the government has a role to play there, definitely, in terms of, as you say, fixing the strategy, but also the modalities, how to go about it. That's also an issue that, from a firm point of view, is difficult to solve.
And I agree. The government has a response, since it's the one running these processes, it has a responsibility. But I think, I'm not sure it's good for anyone to simply depend on the government, right? So communities want to get involved. They want to make sure they have a voice. Civil society wants to get involved. If they're not at the table, they need to push themselves on the table. But really, also when we talk about business, there's a big difference between, say, a particular construction company that might have an endemic interest in the construction of that port versus all the smaller businesses in a region that have just as legitimate a claim to the value that could be in that region. And it's up to those businesses, and it's in their best interest to collaborate in order to push a stronger voice that balances out the voice of the large company that may find it easier to get in on those discussions.
Interesting. So there's a lot of movements that happen throughout the world, especially in India and China, where a lot of new projects are being opposed by local communities, and we have seen a lot of good results arising out of that. So maybe other communities, especially the ones who will get affected the most, the point is that they are the ones who should come up and raise the voice against such projects instead of having that laid-back attitude that the government will take care of it.
Absolutely. And I know that's really hard in some countries because it is, sometimes it's culturally embedded that's government's role, that's what it should do. But I think we see time and again around the world in developed countries or developing countries, we depend on government to represent our interests at our own peril. It's got to be incumbent upon us to take action and to get in there. And it doesn't mean you have to take an activist stance necessarily. It's just you have to make sure, on the civic side, you're electing the politicians you want to truly represent your interests. On the other side, once you've elected those officials, you don't then just turn around and wait until the next election, however many years down. You have to keep them to task, and there's absolutely no reason why you can't find ways to participate. If you as an individual can't do it, you band people together. And like we were saying, when we're looking at the business community, let's not treat the business community as this homogenous group made up only of large multinational companies or large even national companies that dominate in terms of resources. There's lots of smaller firms out there, and those smaller firms are comprised of more people who have a big voice in terms of votes.
Interesting. I think this was a very healthy discussion on how economic development decisions can be balanced with environmental considerations. So thank you everyone for sharing your views on this.